All right. Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and it is time to ruin some dinner or lunch with my friend Diana Butler Bass.
Hey, I love the new music.
Well, I've got this little Bluetooth hookup thing, so I have more music options.
So, and this one was to go with people throwing pasta in each other's faces.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, good.
Yeah. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun. So, we're 100 days in, and there's been so much winning, our heads are spinning.
Or the world is spun off of its axis.
Yeah,
Something is spinning.
something is spinning, and yeah. Well, have you been amused? Have you been amused at people attempting to talk about the first 100 days like it's some normal first 100 days? Like the number of like news things I see, and I'm like 2 minutes in, I'm like, what? Why are we doing? What's going? This isn't normal. Like, no, we're not comparing this to FDR and what W did. This is not how this works. What was that editorial meeting where you went through all that's happened and said, all right, so what are our analogies in recent history?
There are none. But you must be watching different news sources than me, because I have taken to what I call tight curation of what's coming into my feed and what I'm paying attention to. And so I haven't seen any normie attempts to brush, whatever, put lipstick on this pig. Everybody that I've seen is like deer in the headlights, screaming, throwing pasta, something. So I kind of like my news sources right now. The people that I pay most attention to, I think, are, I do listen to NPR, but I don't think they've done a whole lot of normie-ish stuff. They're just kind of trying to go straight down the middle because they're worried about losing their funding. So they're just literally reporting facts and stuff, what's going on a given day. And then I get a lot off of the Bulwark and some other trusted sources over on Substack, a little bit of New York Times, their daily podcast wrap up. So I'm pretty close in, not spending a whole lot of time on hanging on the news.
I try to watch the ones that friends that are having a very different experience, or family members that are like, I like this, and then I check it out and I'm like, oh, that's an interesting reality.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm in it, but
Once in a while, like over at the Bulwark, they post some conservative right-wing show that one or the other of them has been invited to. And so just like last night, I was watching Piers Morgan.
Oh,
yeah. And that was, I mean, even Tim Miller, when he posted it on his Substack, was sort of shocked by what happened on Piers Morgan. He literally wound up yelling at some pro-MAGA guy, "Don't you know that's a lie?" And the pro-MAGA guy was yelling back, "The government would never lie to us. Do you think the government would lie to us?" And Tim Miller's just sitting there going, "Yes, they're lying to you." It came out of a completely different universe than what I occupied.
Do you think the government would lie to you? And then you just think of every military action that's happened in their lifetime, and you're like, well, I don't know. How did Vietnam work? How did Iraq work? No, we're not. When you think of institutions with a deep integrity, even if it costs them immediate political incentives, you think of American politicians known for just truth telling and capturing it and making sure that the press never spins anything or it becomes an accomplice in their cover up of reality. It's just because we need to be clear about what our situation is, Diana. Then we can figure it out.
Well, if you think about that historically, the politicians and presidents who have gotten in the most trouble are the ones who tell the truth. So it's like Jimmy Carter, he just wouldn't ever. I mean, all that level politicians have to do some level of protecting top secret material, and there are certain things they have to withhold for very important reasons, I'm sure. But sort of all in all, Carter, the energy crisis is horrifying. We have to get off of fossil fuels, turn your heat down, put a sweater on, all the things that he talked about were true, and people didn't want to hear them. And so, and also things about colonialism that he talked about early on, and racism, and the problems in the Middle East. These are all issues that he told the truth about. And now we can see that he was telling the truth very clearly. But at the time, people just, no, no, give us the lies, give us the lies. And so he, no, was only president for 4 years. So to me, that's kind of a sad thing. I mean, I don't want to sound cynical about American politics, but the truth is is that voters don't often like the truth. They want a narrative that fits their view of the world. And that whole tendency, I think, began, somewhere right after World War II, and has done nothing but deepen with the development of the kinds of media delivery systems we have now. Because hey, one of the interesting things I think this year has been the success of George Clooney being on Broadway with the play that used to be a film, Good Night and Good Luck, about Ed Morrow. And that was sort of that golden age of the Walter Cronkites and Ed Morrows, and the people who would get it onto television and tell John Chancellor, tell you the truth. These are how many people died in Vietnam today. This is a photograph of our army dropping napalm bombs on villagers across the world. And so that kind of truth telling through the media was actually something that happened more when some of our viewers, at least, were a bit younger, and we can kind of remember that. But now you can watch, as we both have done, entire networks and just see nothing but a string of made up narrative for hours and hours and hours and hours on end.
Well, but before we kind of look at a lot of there's a lot of recent data and stuff coming out about what's been going on. What's been going on with you? We haven't got to chat in a bit.
I've been pretty busy. I'm working on the manuscript of that new book back there, Beautiful Year, which comes out in November. It's up for pre-sale now. People can get it online at their favorite booksellers. And so that's been a fun project, including the fact, Tripp, it has illustrations.
Ooh.
No, I've never done a book that has illustrations before. So I've been working with this artist and the publishers in New York. And it was really interesting to try to conceptualize the Christian year through pen and ink sketches without them being corny.
Yeah.
The corny factor was always hanging there.
Always available when it goes to Christians doing art.
Yeah. So I kind of had to keep turning away from that factor. But the artist really was happy to do that. The artist wanted to conceptualize them so that they didn't just look like the sort of drawings you get from those cut and paste online sites for Sunday school bulletins.
Yeah. Yeah. If it's not, if you don't want it to be cheesy or make it so cheesy, it's, ironic, where it just looks like little cartoon characters put on a felt board,
Precious Moments figures or something. But so that's been fun and creatively interesting and challenging. And then so I have been doing a little bit of traveling, had some really interesting speaking engagements. This past week I was in Boston actually, it was last weekend. I was in Boston for 2 days, helping out with something Bill McKibben asked
Hmm.
me to do, and that is to help launch a sort of 5-month project that a lot of environmentalists, especially environmentalist groups that are religiously based, are doing. It's called Sunday. There's going to be a big national day of mobilization in September, a single day where everyone is going to be focusing on its national shift to solar power. But in the run up to that, there's a lot of events looking at renewables and replacing fossil fuel with solar, which is actually something that is within our grasp in this decade. We could get off of fossil fuel by and large and replace it with especially solar power. And so this is about all of that good news, all the good news of Sunday. Sunday is coming. And so that was really fun to be in Boston. Our friends in Massachusetts have not lost their revolutionary spirit. Over the weekend, someone asked me at the hotel, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Oh, I'm going to be in this protest at Old North Church." And they said, "Oh, yeah, it's another weekend like that. I think there are protests all over the city. There are probably going to be thousands of people out on the Boston Common and this, that, and the other thing." And that is true. I have not been in a city where I saw so much public negative criticism of the current administration, and people literally on the streets essentially comparing Trump to King George III.
Hmm.
And when it comes to people in Massachusetts, they don't have good memories of King George III.
Yeah.
And so it
Trump
was
doesn't have
fun.
a cool wig either.
No, he does not have a cool wig. So anyway, that was really fun, and it was great being at Old North Church. We lit the steeple up green, and Michelle Wu, who is the mayor of Boston, was actually part of this whole presentation with a number of us who were speaking. And there was a wonderful Broadway singer who was our musician. And I mean, it's just incredible. But Michelle Wu, when she pushed the button that lit the tower green, we all had green candles that we were holding up in the church. Um, all of the bridges and several of the public buildings in Boston also turned green
Hmm.
at that moment. And so we Paul revered it, um, for
Oh, yeah.
replacing fossil fuels, and it was loads of fun. So I'm doing right now kind of a lot of things that I just sort of want to do,
Hmm.
and having a great time meeting a lot of new people and working with different communities about different aspects of what's going on now. And so it's nice to be with my friends that I've worked with for decades, but I would say that sort of the reach of the work that I'm doing is broadening, and I'm really grateful to be participating in new conversations.
Yeah. Awesome.
Mhm.
Awesome. Well, the I went to Minneapolis to do the site visit for Theology Beer Camp, which was a lot of fun.
Oh my gosh. So where are we
Um,
going to be?
Minneapolis, or St. Paul. Sorry, they get really upset if you confuse which side of the river you're on.
Yes, they do.
Um, and I should have learned it by now. I've had multiple people from Luther correct me when I'm like, Luther Seminary in Minneapolis, and they're like, no, we're in St. Paul. And I understand when I tell people I'm from Raleigh, and then someone says, "Oh, like Durham or Chapel Hill." You're like, "No, Durham. That's where Duke Blue Devils are." I'm not from there. Uh, but that
Get thee behind me, Satan.
yeah, yeah that was a lot of fun. And we got chickens, and Alicia's wanted chickens for years. And one of our neighbors has chickens, and then they're like, "Oh, well, there's this chick. We want a chick." Next thing you know, there's a bunch of them, and so I'm a chicken dad, and I think they're so cute, Diana. Little chickens,
Oh,
and they like to just sit on you, and you know, just be cute little chickens. And then Cora took a picture of me with these chickens, and just the size differential between me and like 13 chickens sitting on my lap. It was either cute or scary looking. I felt like it was like a giant that could just kill these little bitty dinosaurs
Oh.
if you put the wrong uh the wrong the wrong caption on it. But now there's even more bird noise in my backyard. So, which I sit on the deck most of the time when I'm not recording, and sometimes when I do record, but not for classy people like you.
It sounds like we both been having some interesting adventures. I think that people might have missed us being together for the last 100 days, but it's not because we've been mad at each other or anything. It's like we've been really pretty busy. I think both of us sort of testing out new ideas. And, at first I think we both felt, what are we going to say? We were a little bit, I think, kind of lost, but I feel like I've found my footing over Lent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's been, and Dom and I just finished the Lent class, and it went really well. And surprisingly, if Dom helps introduce Paul and what his vision of the resurrection could mean for the present, it helps work through some of the evangelical Paul baggage.
I think that Dom might have been the first person who pointed out to me that there was actually an argument in the New Testament itself over the nature of the resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
And that Paul has a much more, how can we say it, a much different view than Luke, or the Lucan tradition, and that it's more mystical, more open, it's less bodies in that sense, or there's a different vision of what a body is. And so I think that was really helpful to me. It's not a denial of something that we call a bodily resurrection. It's an argument over the nature of what body is. And
Mm-hmm.
that was actually an ancient argument. Oh, well, now I'm on his territory, but I mean, I think you know that too. And I love presenting that in lectures and stuff. And people go, oh, wait a second. Paul's the kind of the good guy in this argument.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, yeah, Paul got some things pretty right.
Yeah. It's funny when you're going through the questions and stuff, setting up for the Q&As, and the volume of them that have a preface statement going, I'm really uncomfortable by how compelling Dom has made Paul to me, or something like this. I would hate to tell any of my friends that I'm more of a Pauline Christian, but I don't know if I told you this, but at Dom and Phil Clayton are doing like a tag team thing at Theology Beer Camp.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm definitely coming then.
It was Dom's idea, and he was like, I want to tell the biblical story, like a big picture account of the story of God and relationship to creation's groaning in the biblical story. Phil's going to tell the scientific story of the cosmos and creation's groaning, and then we'll have a live Homebrewed podcast where they work it out together.
Oh my gosh, my sermon at Old North Church for Bill McKibben's Sunday event was on that verse, was on the animate life of the earth,
mm-hmm.
and the emotional life of the earth, and that the text. I mean, this was one of the things when I was going through the text that really surprised me, is that Paul is. I don't know why I never noticed this before, but I always thought it was about Jesus, that all creation groans for the arrival of the Son of God, for Jesus to come and fix everything. But that's not what it says. It says that basically the creation is groaning that the children of God, the sons, plural of
mm-hmm.
God, will get it, will do their work on behalf of creation's longings.
Yeah.
And I was like shocked when I realized this. It's like, here I am in this room full of all these, 300-400 progressive types, some of whom are Christian, but it was an interreligious event, and there were a lot of people there who weren't religious at all because it's New England. And I was defending Paul, and it's like, oh, this is painful, but it worked so perfectly. So I was
Mhm.
just in that verse. I love that verse. I've got to be there.
Well, the you know, just the idea of Phil and Dom going back and forth after they have done talks telling the biblical story and the cosmic story, I'm just like,
Right,
even an average conversation will be epic.
right.
But
But on that,
knowing how good both of them are at kind of conversation and engaging other people, I'm going in with high expectations.
yeah. Hey, well, we really should probably look at some of this data.
Oh yeah,
Speaking of high expectation conversation, because there's a lot going on right now with this 100
really?
days. And well, there's just a lot going on. But in particular, with understanding what's happening with churches
Hmm.
and Christianity and what's Christian national, what's the scope and direction of Christian nationalism? I mean, this has been pretty startling in certain ways. Expected, but startling to see it embodied nevertheless. And
Yeah,
the data is showing us some interesting stuff.
yeah. So we're gonna try something, but we can always just decide it doesn't work because it worked in my head, Diana.
Talk about
Diana,
the tag team.
yeah, Diana sends me one. We were talking on the phone and mentions, oh, there are these two different studies coming out and blah 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 blah. I'm like, oh, okay, we'll send it to me, and then like my normal way of reading data and organizing it, and then I'm like, oh, well, there's this connects to this or this. Then what would be the most interesting, like surprising things or like the takeaways or whatever? So I I picked 5 topics and pulled
So
out data
so
from
these
them.
are the things that surprised you and you want me to
Yeah,
look at them.
yeah. My so I thought I'd just say a bit about the data and thing, and then you just say whatever you want, and then we'll see if it works. Because I've had 5 of them. We don't have to use them all. This is an experiment. In my head, it made perfect sense, Diana.
Okay.
Well, who knows what in real life it is. Okay, so the first one is this like unexpected consensus on religious liberty. I was not anticipating this. And so 78, the Trump had talked about, oh, we need a federal task force to work on all the anti-Christian bias. That 78% of Americans oppose it. Um, and when you look at it using the PRRI's categories, right, of Christian nationalist adherents, which is the top line, is 51%. Those that sympathize, 69. Christian nationalist skeptics, 60 or 84% oppose, and then 96% oppose if they reject Christian nationalism. And what's fascinating is all of them, a majority, oppose, and if you just took white evangelical Protestants overall, 66% opposed. So I thought this was at least one mildly positive piece that Tripp's deep dark nightmares after his worst version of the election came true. I was worried this could even been worse. This is my attempt to look at the bright side about this unexpected consensus on religious liberty.
Yeah, this one surprised me too. Um, Maybe it does show uh, a, a deeply surprising commitment to this principle that is so long held in American society. And if I think about the fact that so many evangelicals agreed with it, that even through all of this stuff about Christian nationalism, how much evangelical churches have changed in the last 20 or 30 years, they've always been pretty proud, I think, of the fact that religious freedom developed out of the Baptist tradition. And so there'd be tons of people, even vigorous Christian nationalists, who went to Sunday school and sort of drank the milk of American history with Roger Williams. So maybe this is showing that sort of long trajectory of Roger Williams' influence. And also, it could be showing the fact that they are worried about any level of government theological tinkering.
Yeah.
Because they also in these churches for many, 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 many decades have been talking about how the principle of the separation of church and state, um, even though they kind of reject that in other ways, but that the principle of religious freedom protects the church as much or probably even more than it does the state. So I think it maybe shows some echoes of that, which is pretty, that's not bad. That's optimistic.
Yeah, and the one of the things that I that at least could be really helpful in my mind is knowing that even in places where the most vocal leaders of the community are there, a larger portion of their audience is much more sympathetic to um,
Right.
a kind of civic neighborliness about the freedom of conscience for people, and see that protecting someone who disagrees with you freedom is connected to protecting your own. And knowing that's there, I think it can open up different ways of articulating what's going on, where we go, oh, even the ardent adherents to Christian nationalists, 51% of them have this shared value. So then part of it will be introducing with integrity our neighbors in other faith traditions or in other spaces,
Mm-hmm.
so that they see that this value that they share with us is it can be expressed differently once the experience of the others understood.
Yeah, and it also might show some of the primacy of religion in these communities, that when it comes to thinking about religious freedom, that's sort of front and center to them. But they don't see a sort of shared humanity around race or around human sexuality or gender quite as much, because those aren't their primary issues. Those are not the driving way they sort of they interpret the universe. But when it comes to this one, this is an important, kind of top level, uh, what do you call those things, the pyramid, the Maslow pyramids of
Hierarchy of needs.
hierarchy of needs. Well, I think one of the evangelical top pieces in their hierarchy is religion. It is theology. And so they understand threats to that before they'll understand those other things that connect human beings as well. So I think it'd be interesting, is it possible to move them down, shift around some of those needs in their pyramid?
Mm-hmm.
Is it, and I think for some evangelicals that has happened. There are evangelicals who have figured out that, like, gay people are human, and so it's moved up into their list of valued priorities, and that then became a breaking point for them with the larger community. But I think that your analysis is good, and I think that, these are just some suggestions as we try to understand this particular surprise in the data.
Yeah. Well, the next one's not nearly as optimistic.
Most of them were pretty bad,
Yeah, I know.
actually.
I was trying to be positive there.
Thanks for starting a nice place.
Yeah, and this is really looking at democracy, authority, and violence. So there are two different lines in this study that like come together and make me think, how in the world does this make sense with the conservatives doing the Romans 13:1 bit on us? Let everyone be subject to the governing authority. And then let's say you were asking about support for the president ignoring Congress and the Supreme Court. 41% of Christian nationalist adherents agree. 27% of sympathizers agree. 28% of Republicans, and 22% of Americans overall. I mean, when you think of where that 22% comes from, when just sympathizers and Republicans are in the 20s, but Christian nationalist adherents are there, that's revelatory and uncomfortable, only to be intensified when you ask them about their support for political violence. And the phrase in the question
Yeah.
was, do true patriots may need violence? And now, there was not a follow-up question like, have you watched The Patriot starring Mel Gibson? aka the director of Passion of the Christ, because I really think that would have really added a layer onto this. But 28% of Christian national adherents and 22% of sympathizers agree that true patriots need violence. So, it is fascinating that there is a difference for a hardcore Christian nationalist and just ignoring Congress and the Supreme Court, and then the citizen just cutting somebody. But the at the party level, 19% of Republicans say yes, and only 8% of Democrats. And so both of these elements kind of lead us to ask, like, how do we reconcile these authoritarian tendencies with the Christian tradition, and how do we see these kinds of tendencies when we look at the data? Like, what does that say for the life of the church and trying to engage the larger body of Christ and recognize just what it reveals about the soul of the nation of sorts. Those two sleep losing data.
Robbie Jones, who did this survey, pointed out in another podcast yesterday about how the desire for violence was actually, those numbers had gone down since the last election in those two communities. So the numbers you point out about the Christian nationalism adherents, was that 22% of them, or
for violence it's 28 and 22.
Okay, for adherents and sympathizers. Mm-hmm. So it's roughly 1 in 4. And then for Republicans, it's 19% overall.
Yep.
Yeah. So those numbers were down from the last time Robbie took this survey, which was before the election.
It was when Biden was in.
Right. And so I think that one of the things that is showing up now is when you're in charge, you don't want to approve of violence to change the government.
Yeah.
Because the violence is going to be directed to you. And so that's going to pull off some of that liking of taking over the government with, like, pitchforks and flags. And attacking the Capitol, because then your people are the ones who are going to be the victims of that. And so political violence, we don't think that's such a good idea. So the number has actually sunk on that. But those other numbers about ignoring the courts
and Congress.
Have you seen all the stuff that's, I mean, if you're reading and looking at some of the Republican stuff right now, that's kind of an interesting breaking point within the Republican Party right now. There are some people who voted for, this is one of the places where you actually are hearing Trump regret among some Republicans, is that they don't actually like the fact that Trump is breaking the law. There's this kind of essential commitment on the part of a lot of people who vote Republican towards fairness, or at least what they perceive as fairness. And it's not fair that some people have to obey the law and these people don't. And so there's really beginning to be a rift in the Republican Party around this very point.
Yeah, I told you one of the times we should have recorded a number of our phone calls we've had over the last 100 days. It starts as like checking in on something, and an hour and a half later, there's an unrecorded ruining dinner episode.
Why didn't we tape this, Tripp?
But I mentioned how the moment some of that tariff stuff had happened, my cigar lounge barometers of what independents and more conservative people think. You had no one defending him in the lounge, or, where 3 weeks earlier, they're going on, and it's only gotten worse. But that particular element, and these are, conservative, not all, some are libertarian, some would say they're independent, but they, definitely vote much more conservative, that they were super triggered by it because some of them couldn't vote for Republicans in North Carolina because they've been doing that stuff, right? Like North Carolina Republicans
no.
We're gonna protest every vote we need until this judge gets overturned. We're
Right.
gonna jerry rig this and this and this. We're gonna ignore the court's advising on all this. We're gonna get struck down by the Supreme Court over changing the day before the new administration comes in what the governor can do because we just don't like we lost, right? So that I was surprised, like they responded bigly to that topic. In part because they've seen just how detrimental it's been on just life in the state. But the but one of the guys who he has a car, he owns a car lot, not like a dealership, and so he was super pissed when when the price goes up on stuff that's in process of getting here. But he said, well, look, if we aren't going to, what's the point of having Congress and the Senate and not pass anything if we're just extending the executive power? What do you think President AOC is going to do? And what are we going to say? Like, oh no, she's going to come in and say, oh, for national defense, we're going to nationalize all of Elon Musk's companies, the internet, Amazon, social media platforms, because it's good for our health, it builds community, and blah 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 blah. And when the court says no or the Congress doesn't, she can just go like, what are you talking about? The president has this authority. What if she wants to just pardon all those BLM activists and set them back loose in our, and he's, you could just imagine what he's going through, but underneath it, he's sitting there gaming it out, where it's like, if the power of the executive extends and the ability for the people to have any voice in what happens in Congress or, people without theoretically the same incentive structure like in the courts, then you're just going to have constant cultural whiplash, and it's not good for business. It's not good for our neighbors. He's like, I can't even talk to one of my kids anymore because they know I voted for this guy, and I didn't think he'd do any of this. And so the like on that element, I do think the more people recognize, you may like a particular thing he does, but the moment that kind of power is legitimated for the executive, what goes on?
Well, that would be what people are thinking about the Abrego Garcia case. There's folks that certainly I've heard talking about this who, they hate the levels of immigration. They want way fewer, particularly Hispanic immigrants in this country. They're no friends to the current state of immigration. But having Abrego Garcia just deported without any due process, literally, I've heard those same people say, if that can happen to him, that can happen to me. And it can happen to me if something, the equivalent is like if AOC became president. And so I'm really hearing that too. And if we watch the numbers on Trump and immigration, that's when they really hit the wall. People were supporting Trump on immigration up until the Abrego Garcia case. And it's not because people don't believe that he might be an MS-13 member. These same people believe that he might be a gang member. But the point is that you got to prove it. He has to be fairly arrested with good evidence. And if then he can be deported, they don't care if he goes to a gulag in El Salvador. That's the part that's not appealing to them. The part that gets them is that it could be them. And that's what we were talking about religious freedom a moment ago.
Yeah.
Is that if people realize that this could backfire on you and the next group could hurt you and the people you love by using the same executive power, the same executive overreach, you're going to give a second thought or two about that.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of it is like Trump's so detached from reality that he, decided to get up in front of Congress and talk about transgender rights. He's in such an echo chamber that anyone that just has moderate connection to another one knows how many kind of nonsensical lies there. It's not even like a jaded ideological interpretation of reality. It's just thinking if you repeat it enough, it's true. And given their the way they've internalized a caricatured version of most people on the left, I would be really scared if some communist atheist person, like Kamala Harris, was ever in charge. Like, oh well,
Mostly they don't understand
she's
that.
gonna force every person in jail to change their genders, and we're gonna pay for it by taxing
Honestly,
churches. That's what that immediately.
you've heard that. I've heard that.
I've heard
That was actually, I heard somebody say that during the election. Is that, I mean, that was that whole thing. If you send your son to school, that he'll come back and he'll be a eunuch. And it's like,
oh, blessed are those that make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God.
well, they don't pay attention to, obey the government either. So scripture is weird, actually.
Okay. I have to say, when you look at these and then think of the Trump's nomination for Pope, it really makes you.
That is, I gotta say, for Lindsey Graham, that was first class trolling. I mean, literally, I did not know Lindsey Graham had that kind of trolling level in him.
If he had put underneath it, like one of those like Twitter polls, the next one was like, which vow's harder for Trump, chastity, poverty,
or obedience,
That's actually there's another timeline.
I want to know the answer.
Where Trump's in purgatory and God's like, look, here's the thing. You're going to be Pope until you're good at it. This is what the thing is, Don. You're going to be Pope until you're good at it. And after that,
he's
eschatological embrace and stuff. But we just need you to work some things out. We don't really know how much is there, so it might take some time. But
it's like some weird version of the picture of Dorian Gray.
Like, Donald,
you're going to live forever.
Speaking of being Pope.
Until you get this right.
It's like Groundhog Day with Donald Trump as Pope.
That's what I feel like this election was anyway. It was like, wait a second, there was a movie about this, and we just kept going back into the same circle.
Yeah, but there is moral progress over each time Bill Murray goes through the day. This is more of a
moral decline. Yeah, and that shows up in those statistics.
Oh, good transition, Diana.
Yeah, we got to go back to those numbers because I can't wait to see what some of the other ones are that surprised you.
All right, so this one is on the competing narratives of discrimination.
Oh, gosh.
So, and there were 3 different little data points that are fascinating. One is that 66% of white evangelical Protestants believe discrimination against Christians equals discrimination against other groups.
Right.
And like where I highlighted those 2, you see they're actually inverted for when you look at Democrats, that they're like, no, discrimination is higher with these other groups. So is there discrimination against Christians? 66% of white evangelicals agree. 79% of Christian nationalist adherents agree.
That's almost a mirror opposite of that Black Protestant line, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
This is why it's so fascinating to me, because the same kind of thing happens on discrimination against white Americans, more broadly. But when it goes to systemic advantages for white Americans, 51% of Americans agree generations of slavery and discrimination have given white people unfair advantages. And it breaks down to 75% of Democrats, 27% of Republicans, but only 32% of white evangelical Protestants agree.
Wow.
And when you think of in the part of it that's kind of interesting for me, that I wanted to hear you talk about, is when you realize how the way we narrate our history, setting up our struggles, pain points, and how we try to explain the problems before us. How problematic are these kind of inverted competing narratives of discrimination?
I think they're pretty. I think that a lot of it is wrapped up in the way that people see history. I mean, one of the things that white evangelical Protestant number, you and I both know this, is there's a lot, and this is classic stuff. A persecution complex is a real thing, and the idea that one is part of a persecuted group is a way of strengthening an in group and creating those boundaries between the group and the world. So the people who are inside of the group, they share an experience being special or different, and that because of this special and different thing that they bear, being the children of God, proclaiming the gospel, being true about dogma, whatever it is, the outside group then sees them as odd or weird or puts pressure on them. And so that's an important boundary marker in sectarian groups and sectarian mindset groups. So that's not too surprising. And I remember, even all those decades ago, sitting in places with sermons that were talking about persecution against Christians. Both today, the most popular one when I was like a teenager was talking about persecution of Christians in Russia. And one of the heroic things for young evangelical to think about doing with their life in the future was smuggling Bibles into the Eastern Bloc. And, we'd have Bible studies about this and what it would be like to be sort of captured as you were taking Bibles across into East Berlin, and what would you do under torture? I mean, these are things we actually talked about as evangelical teenagers, how you would survive a Soviet bloc jail. I don't know if you ever did this, but I literally memorized hymns and Bible verses so that I could carry around sort of a hymn book and a certain number of certain pieces of scripture in my brain, so that if I was ever in a prison for being persecuted, I would be able to sing like the Apostle Paul did when he was in jail in the book of Acts. And that was applauded by all the adults around me. It was seen as being serious and faithful, and oh, what a cool Christian she is. She would sacrifice so much in order to do these things. So that's kind of a emotionally built-in piece of white evangelicalism. And the target of who was persecuting you or where the persecution might come from certainly changed between the time I was growing up and the time you were growing up. I don't know what would it have been then when you were in your teens.
Well, the biggest thing similar to that when I was in school was the first big school shooting in Aurora, Colorado.
Oh
Where they
yeah,
made up this whole story about
the
one of the
one girl.
girls saying that, "Do you believe in God?" And she said yes and shot her. Turns out the whole thing's made up.
Right.
But like that got used all the time at like big youth events or Billy Graham and the DC Talk put out another version of the Book of the Martyrs, the Jesus Freak edition, and where this girl gets added to it, which you gotta. I mean, even if that was true, if we were just going to go through like, bodies eaten apart by lions and all this kind of thing, it to tell all those stories and then throw on like, and you could be one of them.
Right.
Those were all against, these giant oppressive states or like an empire purifying itself or whatever, not like a random act of violence, but that a school shooter being analogous to Caesar just seemed odd. I mean, it didn't then, but like looking back to go like, oh, these big stories of oppression in church history. That's just like
Right. This martyr.
this kid at your school that
Right.
was really mad at Christians.
Yeah, and so I think that people who grow up in that world, we all understand that, because that was just basically in the water. You heard those stories all the time. Those were the models for faith. And I guess it would be a little like growing up Catholic in some senses, and you had that whole martyr culture. Um, and knowing the lives of the saints is kind of a similar thing. um Mainline Protestantism, we all, when I was a little girl, I was actually, grew up in Methodism, and what you wanted to be when you grew up was Reinhold Niebuhr. I mean, that was our idea of saintliness, is that you smoked a pipe and went off to Yale Divinity School and
I understand.
got a
And I-
PhD at Harvard or what have you. So that was giving up one's life for Jesus, in the mainline in the 1960s. Or you could be a protester. There was plenty of that around too. That we did have protesters, and those, you might go to jail with the Berrigan brothers if you're really lucky. But that might impede your career as a lawyer on the other end of it all. So you'd be pretty careful about it.
yeah.
But to compare that, I just want to go real quick with the Black Protestant thing, is that in effect, we believe the truth of a narrative. Now, what is true historically is that there has been plenty of persecution directed at Christians over time in a lot of different circumstances. So there has been religious persecution, and some of it's been on a pretty massive and a really truly ugly scale. But in 20th century America, when I was a teenager, and the turn of century America, when you're like a teenager, we're not talking this. This is not apples and oranges. These are things that are not comparable. And yet we lived in a narrative universe that taught that they were. And so you were always on the lookout for whoever was going to get you, whoever was going to persecute you. Now, you turn that around to Black Protestants, and it's like, come over to my house and I can take you to several sites within essentially walking distance where Black people were lynched.
Mm-hmm.
So, and from their churches, they would be, arrested outside of their churches, or that they would be sold down the river in the 19th century after leaving a congregation. They were scooped up by slave traders and taken to a jail in Alexandria, where they were held and then forced to walk down the Natchez, Mississippi. I can show you those places, and those are real. I can show you the corner where Joseph McCoy's body hung off of a lamp post. And so, honestly, when it comes to invented persecution narratives, and persecution is a real thing, but it wasn't a real thing for white Christians in nice suburban churches in the 20th century in the United States. It was put in our heads by stories and models of saintliness. And then on the other hand, you have Black people growing up in places where they can remember bodies hanging off of trees in front of their congregations and courthouses, and crosses burned on their porches. So you tell me how that is in any way equivalent. It's not. And Black people don't even need to narrate that stuff, because there are people in their congregations who remember it. And so that just makes me mad. And what those statistics show is that this is something that white evangelicals don't like to hear, but it shows how racist they are.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the other things that came to mind, just looking at these different views on discrimination, is like there's always this kind of like who takes the lead in progressive public square rhetoric of it being framed in identitarian ways, and then questions around justice being framed in class ways. And I think that one of the things that I became more confident of looking at this data, and not just that part, is it makes a lot more sense to lead with the class framing that you can see in, right, like the like resisting oligarchy type framing you see with, like, Bernie and AOC stuff and that kind of thing, because it's able to name a power people already have suspicion towards, as discriminating, and one that there's a lot more current evidence of it, right, than your political foe hating your religious beliefs, and we're going to discriminate it. But what about all the billionaires that are behind Trump, uh, holding large amounts of power and pushing against it? When if the identitarian questions are going to run into these parallel realities and narratives that are there, what's the way of telling the present crisis that we're facing in a way where you can have solidarity across these different narratives, recenter a narrative, oligarchy and class type stuff, where it's pragmatic in communication, but also when you're addressing class stuff, you end up addressing or redressing historic prejudice and power problems as well. So looking at it made me think, that actually helps me understand why that kind of response to what Bernie and AOC are doing from so many political independents is insightful, because it's not picking up on these other narratives where there would be so much initial tension before they could, hear what's being offered.
Yeah, and I do think that is really the case, because these questions that we've looked at so far, both of us understand the narratives that are behind those questions because we grew up close to them or in them or spent time with a lot of people who really truly believed all these things. And some of these narratives are invisible to other people in different frames. And so that's when you get the expressions of, say, shock about the first 100 days by so many people who are in the media or who just literally have never heard these things before. This is all new to them. Whereas for many of us, this is a political expression of things that we have heard for much of our lives, but never really imagined it amassing the kind of wealth and power that it has amassed, and now is controlling levers of government, and really even is a narrative that's controlling some of the economic decisions that are being made. I don't think that Jeff Bezos believes any of this. I don't think Elon Musk believes any of this.
Neither one of them give off, I have deep core values that I'd like expressed in the world, and Donald Trump is a vessel to help it be accomplished.
No, but they know that for some reason they feel like part of their personal fortune and their business models are dependent upon submitting to these essentially foreign theological narratives that they might even think personally are kind of nuts. But it's convenient for their main driving narrative, and that is their own power and increasing their own wealth, and putting their own, fists on the levers of government.
Yeah.
And so they don't care. I mean, but then there are other people who do actually kind of care, but that they just don't understand the stories and the depth of identity that has been shaped by these stories of persecution, stories of religious freedom, stories of exclusive truth, which are just par for the course in many of these churches.
Yeah. All right, I'm gonna go to the next one. Otherwise, we'll
not make it.
It happens. It happens. All right, so this one is looking at immigration, citizenship, and perhaps the lack of Christian hospitality in certain areas. And when looking at the question of birthright citizenship, white evangelical Protestants are the only religious group without a majority support for birthright citizenships at 49%. Black Protestants is at 82%, Hispanic Catholics at 77%, and and Americans overall are at 64%, right?
Right.
So this is one of those where if you are a Christian, you're even less likely, by a significant measure, to be against birthright citizenship than your other white American peers. And when it
Do you know where the main line was on this number? Because I noticed you focused on the white evangelical Protestant one. My people would be drilling in on the.
it's they are like 3 or 4% under just generic white. Like if you took white mainline Protestants, their number is a little lower than just white citizens in general.
So Christians
Christians
overall would include,
overall
well, that would
are,
include Black and Hispanic people.
yeah, white Protestants. If you yeah, where if you're Black or Hispanic and religious, you're more welcoming, and if you're white and religious, you're less welcoming.
Yeah.
And you kind of go, huh, I wonder what the feature is here that's going
that holds
on.
these together.
But the other part of it is when Robbie uses the data of Christian nationalist adherents and sympathizers. Sympathizers are at 49%, just like white evangelicals in general. Adherents 47%. But the moment you get to even an evangelical that's a skeptic or a rejecter, those positions follow the others. So where if you reject Christian nationalism, you're 85% in favor of birthright citizenship, and if you're skeptical of it, 67%. And like when you're looking at both like the function of religion and whiteness, there, like when you see that data, like are there particular theological or cultural factors you think would be important, maybe to guide reflection or interpretation of what's going on?
I think that probably the white non-evangelical, which would be the number that includes the mainline, might have broken 50 on this, that their support for birthright citizenship was over half, which, if I remember correctly, that was one of the places I looked very specifically at that number. I mean, that just goes ahead and shows all that you're saying. It shows that in part the immigration experience as well, because it's interesting that Black Protestants who understand that the 14th Amendment is part of their heritage of Reconstruction, one of the few things that was left after Reconstruction was turned back. And so it is what gave their ancestors the right to vote. You take away birthright citizenship, they know that their citizenship is not actually on the chopping block at that point. So that's, and they teach that's taught in every church, every Black church in this country. They know that. They just know that. And then Hispanic Catholics, of course, would be also equally high for similar kinds of reasons. And Jews, I thought that one's really interesting because so many Jews, their ancestors came here during the Holocaust. So it's fairly recent immigration. And then even the ones who have been here longer, the majority of the Jewish community would have come in the 20th century. There were Jews before that, but the huge influx of Jews was in the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s. So that's pretty recent immigration, and that the fact that their children who were all born here are citizens by right would be very important in the Jewish community as well. So it shows something about race, and it shows something about recent immigration or the importance of immigration in communities. And I think most white people just don't think about it.
Yeah. Well, like, I feel like we talked about this when we did that class on the anniversary of 9/11 with Brian. You pointed out
we did
how there's, the who counted as white has changed over time, right? So if we went back 100 years and we're talking about Catholic immigrants, it's like, well, do Irish, are they Americans? So there's this, there's some kind of, there's a historical experience in different European ethnic groups that has changed over time, which that part seems kind of clear. And then the uniqueness of Black Americans, because of birthright citizenship being attached to being able to become full participants in the government. But I wonder if you see a connection, right? And this changing question of who is an American, and like the changing nature of like who's a Christian, because they both seem to always be these boundary markers where you're trying to legitimate something culturally. But when you look at data, where for a significant number of white Americans, asserting Christianity is asserting cultural normativity of whiteness.
Yeah.
And somehow like saying like, well, we want to protect America is like one step more guarded than we want to keep kind of like white culture dominance. That's uncomfortable
Yeah.
to say. But it makes me want to read it that way, and I wonder if you want to talk me down or.
Well, I'm glad you remembered that and you pointed it out, because it actually shows a particular cultural problem that is very difficult even within the MAGA movement. And that is, yes, conceptions of who counted as white changed quite a bit over the 20th century. I mean, I can still remember, okay, so I'm in my 60s, but I can still remember my grandparents who were born at the very beginning of the 20th century. They did not think that Italians and Greeks were white. They literally referred to them by their ethnicities, and they would talk about things like, I mean, this growing up, this is a conversation that I regularly heard around me. They would talk about their olive colored skin. And they would talk about the fact that they all had brown eyes. And I remember one year when I was a teeny little thing, is that a brunette, uh, brown eyed woman won Miss America. And you would have thought that the end of the world came for my relatives, because it's like, Miss America has to be blonde. You know, a Miss America has to have blue or green eyes. Maybe she can be redheaded, but that's it. That's what America. That is America. That represents America. And so, literally, I feel like I grew up in some like weird century, years and years and years ago, in some dark cave. But that's literally how my ancestors, or how my immediate relatives thought about race, is that race was an issue of skin clarity, a certain eye color, and certain hair color. It was Anglo-Saxon, meant white. That was what white people were. And then there were these suspicious Europeans who they thought they were of mixed racial origin. And so they worried about them. And then there were the people who were clearly out of the picture. So, but then by the time I'm in my 20s, I mean, I thought it was stupid, even when I was a little kid. I mean, I remember thinking, like, what planet does my grandfather live on that he would even think that? And my mom had a lot to do with that. My mother was the closest thing to an anti-racist activist that you could get, I think, in the 1960s, growing up in a family like that. And so she thought that was stupid too. And so I grew up with a whole different view, which came largely through my mother. And by the time I was an adult, you just stopped hearing stuff like that in the general culture. I mean, that just faded away. So it changed with the baby boom. We get blamed for a lot, but hey, here's something we did okay, I think. But then, so whiteness broadened to privilege and to hold on to power of white people. You had to broaden the category. So that wasn't the greatest motivation. I think my mother had better of a motivation for broadening her categories of what counted as, not different. So now the problem is around religion, because you can't, in effect, broaden the category of whiteness much more. Although there's a broadening that is now including different Hispanic racial groups to try to make whiteness bigger. And that's happening on the part of both traditionally understood white people, and it's happening in parts of the Hispanic community. It's like, hey, well, we're descended from Spain or whatever, and there's always been that in Hispanic cultures in North and South America. It's like, do you have Indian, native, indigenous ancestry? Do you have ancestry from enslaved peoples? Do you have an ancestry from the ruling Spanish class? This is an argument you hear around Santa Fe sometimes, even still today, about statuary and who gets valued in the history of New Mexico. It has a lot to do with these different kinds of Hispanic racial groups and ethnic groups. So there's all so that's the one place where the category of white is still kind of under contest and is expanding. But now the issue of religion comes into play. 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 66% of all Americans were Protestants. And then, about 20% or so were Catholics, about 2% were Jews. And then the rest was divided between everybody else. Now, in order to say that the United States is a Christian nation, you have to include every single group of Christians. And what is true is that America as a whole, the United States as a whole, is roughly 66% Christian. But that's very different than 66% of America being Protestant. So now when you say America is a Christian nation, you're saying that includes Hispanic Catholics, that includes gone-in Pentecostals, that includes Black Protestant, classic Black Protestants, it includes mainline Protestants. There's no theological differentiation.
And Mormons, which
and Mormons,
which had the same inclusion thing with Mitt Romney, like Catholicism and JFK's.
Right. Oh, and Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
I mean, you name it, you have to put everybody theologically on board with you or not in the category Christian in order to maintain a Christian majority. And even harder for the MAGA world is you have to put in everybody of color. Because right now, Christianity in the United States as a whole, if we just look at the Christian part of it, and now we're making all Christians in the United States a different chart that equals 100% of all Christians in the United States, roughly, I think 55 to 60% of those folks are white, and somewhere between 40 and 45% are Christians of color. So that means pretty soon the Christian pie will be divided 50-50 between white Christians and Christians of color. So which do you privilege? Do you privilege race? Like over here with the argument with Hispanic ethnicities and how you conceptualize what it means to be a person of those different racial origins and ethnic origins? Or do you privilege religious hegemony in which you're saying that Christianity is the only thing that counts? But now, if that's true, you've got to make all these people of color count and all these immigrants count.
Yeah. And that changes, I think, even the role religion will have in politics going forward.
Yeah.
Last week, I had Eric Swalwell, the representative, on the podcast, and we were talking about the Democratic Party's religion problem. And, those demographic changes, I think, are making sense to the Democratic Party, that we shouldn't be having politicians in one party claim a religious identity they have little practice in reference to, while the Democratic Party sits around and just mutes everything they do in public to have any connection to their, faith,
Right.
tradition, and story, because the long-term trends is that the Christian church is going to be a diverse one in America, and setting aside, making people choose between their religious identity and being part of a larger political plurality just seems like a self-defeating thing.
And that's actually what they're facing. And I don't know if some of the leaders who are more theological and the more thoughtful leaders in the Christian nationalist MAGA space, and I'm just assuming there are lots of them. I mean, I know there are lots of people with PhDs, a lot of people who write books, a lot of people who are kind of thought leaders in that space. I don't know if they've really thought about this problem as much as as much as it's obvious for those of us who are in theological spaces outside and can look in. But this is a big issue. This is a really, really, really big issue. If you're going to have a homogeneous country, what do you privilege? And there's a clear collision course on race and religion, and you're going to have to pick. And the data, like Robbie keeps presenting, it presents, and the Pew data, it does something I think kind of similar, is that the conflict isn't entirely clear right now to people in the space, but the focus of it is around Hispanic folks in this country. And that's what, how do Hispanic peoples conceptualize themselves in terms of citizenship and religious identity and all of the diversity that entails, because it's a hugely diverse community. But then how do the communities outside, which are trying to mobilize, manipulate, use whatever, the political power of those communities towards their ends, the ends of the larger projects that they have about America, people don't know how to reckon with that, and the diversity and the conflict and the real struggle that's being evidenced within American Hispanic communities, both religious and non-religious right now.
Yeah. All right. I got one more.
Okay. And this is our last slide.
Yeah.
And we should tell people, absolutely, these slides are not online because these are your slides. You built these slides out of Robbie Jones's slides and data for the new project that just came out from Public Religion Research. And that project was called Democracy at a Crossroads. And it only came out 2 days ago. And and that data, Democracy at a Crossroads from PRRI, all of Robbie's charts and that data is online. Mm-hmm. And these are your charts built out of his charts.
Yeah. And the first one was from the Pew one that came out.
Okay.
The first one he sent. But my notes pulled lots of stuff from both of them and then was like, but Robbie has the 4 different levels of how close you are to Christian nationalism, which helps. It makes it a lot easier to pinpoint what are the cross threads across religious communities in America and at that intersection.
This is a very interesting exercise in how Tripp's mind works, by the way. So I'm really liking it.
both of them had we're tracking the changes in popularity of Trump over time, and then what it correlates to. JD Vance and Elon Musk are even doing worse than Trump. I've assumed I would get so distracted about how much I detest JD Vance and might make that he killed Pope jokes, so I went with Elon Musk to highlight something that if we were uncomfortable in the first term, looking at Christians going like, that's your hero, Donald Trump, like where the idea of him being Pope is a joke as to, are there any parts of being Pope that he would enjoy and could contemplate, like that you end up doing it with Elon Musk, who is even like he doesn't even feign being Christian. The more we know about his sex life and reproduction patterns is crazier. And he's got the I use HGH but don't work out bod, which is just its own thing. Anyway, but Musk's popularity among white evangelical Protestants is 61% favorable. And
how is that even possible?
It is the only group where with a majority that have a favorable opinion of him. Can you think of someone who embodies the antithesis of the Beatitudes more than that man. Like, if you went through Luke's blessed are woe dichotomies, he's just circling woes. Like, he's a big woe circler. And so Christian nationalist adherents, 60% favorable, sympathizers 58, Americans overall 58 unfavorable. And in his job approval among white evangelical Protestants is 68%. What in the world explains the strong alignments between certain religious groups and a series of controversial figures crystallized in Satan's most effective sidekick, Elon Musk? This one drove me nuts the most, Diana. I was just like, that guy? Like, why are there Christians that are like, their MAGA friends are like, yeah, I'm not too sure about him anymore. But if you go to church, you're like, I don't know, he has a point, right? Oh.
The only thing I can put it with, Tripp, I mean, I'm with you. I mean, it's just like this. I look at this one and there's part of me that just wants to be completely baffled. But the only thing I can think of is something that is so kind of foreign to my own experience, but I know theoretically it's there, is the prosperity gospel. Is the idea that rich people are somehow uniquely blessed by God. And if Elon Musk is the richest guy in the world, well, that means that he's really blessed. And I remember years and years ago, and I was in graduate school, and I worked with George Marsden. So most of my work was in the more theological and Calvinist kinds of streams of American Protestantism. But I also took classes and knew Grant Wacker, who studied Pentecostalism. And I took an entire course on American Pentecostalism and charismatic movements with Grant Wacker. It was a great class, by the way. I learned a lot. And Grant told this story. And at the time, it just sort of, I didn't even know what to make of it. But it was a joke that sort of went around Pentecostal and charismatic circles. And it was about it was told about Jimmy Swaggart, who back in those days was in trouble for all kinds of sexual exploits and manipulation of money and things. And so supposedly, this was like pretend, is that somebody would see Swaggart leave his house every day and get in his car and drive to a local motel. And they would see also then a car pull up with the same woman who would get out every single day at the same time. And they would go into the motel room and close the door, and they would each come out an hour later and go to their cars and go on with their day. And so eventually, in this joke, this story that was sort of unfolded, this got uncovered. And so someone went and they presented this to the board of elders. And the board of elders was, tell me the story. And so the person who witnessed this said, all this stuff is that, Jimmy Swaggart would when he would get out of the motel room, he'd walk towards his car. He was smoking a cigarette, and he would get in the car and he'd drive away. And the board of elders was absolutely shocked. And they said, oh, that's just terrible. And the guy said, yeah, I thought you'd want to know that he was having an affair. And the board of elders looks at him and says, no, why was he smoking a cigarette? Grant Wacker told us this story. We're all graduate students. And he said, if you want to understand Pentecostalism, you got to understand that story. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't understand that story, but I think I do now.
Why was he smoking a cigarette? Well, maybe they just need to know that Elon Musk is fueled by ketamine. There's always...
I've wondered if that would help, actually. But he's a rich guy, and he's blessed by God. And hey, David had many wives. Solomon had many wives. Who cares if Elon Musk has 14 or 15 or 17 baby mamas, whatever it is now, and is looking for more
embryos? Like, that's one of the other things. Like, how are pro-life people into someone who has large numbers of embryos fertilized and then genetically selecting them? Like, And this is the guy who wants to go to Mars and put the internet in your head. Like,
Right.
what do you think's gonna? Anyway.
Well, I mean, the truth of it is that in some Christian traditions, money and power are seen as markers of the divine, and they have biblical precedent. They feel like they have biblical precedent for this, and that the rich and the powerful get to do what they want to do in their personal lives if they're doing the will of God in their public duties. And so this is, of course, brings us back to your first slide. And now, because Musk is part of the government, we have to obey him.
Well, I wonder if that hermeneutic will ever get applied to George Soros
No.
when he funds AOC's campaign and she nationalizes all his businesses. You know, like, look, I had a problem with it, but the guy's rich.
Right.
So
You see, our world, the world we run in church, money is, people like money, but people have a lot of suspicions about money in liberal communities. It's like ill-gotten gain and what you worship, and there's a whole different attitudes towards billionaires. But the billionaire in the Pentecostal church, the billionaire in the prosperity gospel setting, that's a different thing.
all right. Well, now was there something? What else stuck out in all that data that wasn't as fascinating to me? Was this a
Well,
Stripp's attempt to guess at things?
well, I went for all the, as I said a few minutes ago, I went for all the numbers about white non-evangelical Protestants,
Mhm.
and I think that one of the things the data showed was there's only been a very, very small erosion of favorability towards Trump, and now we have job approval numbers um, in all white communities, and that includes white mainline or white non-evangelical churches. There's a slight drop,
Mhm.
but not much. And what was it? 54% overall of white mainliners voted for Trump in November, and apparently something like 52% of them still approve of what he's doing. So that number and that divide in the non-evangelical community is way. I mean, it's too high. It is way, 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 way too high. Um, we failed. I mean, to me, this shows the absolute failure. And I'm sorry, because some of people who listen to us as individuals have put a lot on the line, and I don't think they've necessarily failed as leaders. Personally, I think that they've probably done. I know that they've done a lot of really brave stuff, but the institutions of white Christianity in this country have failed um, as a whole, because it's giving Donald Trump and all of this anti anti Jesus, anti biblical, anti moral stuff a pass. And I look at the white evangelical community, of non-evangelical communities, of which I am part, the people who entrust me with some level of leadership in this world. And I just think to myself, why so quiet? What, and I know exactly why, because we're a declining community, and declining communities don't like challenging anybody, because they're afraid that if they get out there and they challenge people politically, if they say what they're actually thinking, because I know what they're thinking, if they say what they're actually thinking about Donald Trump, they're afraid that they're going to offend somebody or send away their biggest donor. Well, to me, that is a moral failure of the first rank. It shows that we lack courage. It shows that we lack trust. It shows that we lack belief in the principles of the things that we say we hold dear. It says that we do not actually believe and put into work our baptismal vows. And that makes me very, 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 very angry. And I am in despair. I looked at those two surveys, and I started to cry because those numbers should be not even close to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I had made on my list when deciding it, I pulled out the numbers on a few issues. So like on the administrative actions, about half of white non-evangelical Protestants approve tariffs. 59% of white non-evangelical Protestants oppose implementing new tariffs.
Well, money does hit their pocketbooks.
Yeah. But 39%, birthright citizenship, 60% of white non-evangelical Protestants favor the Constitution. So it's 40% are against it. 82% of oppose the anti-Christian bias task force.
Yeah. So there's some differences. Yeah.
The a majority, not as many as you'd want, still support vaccines. But it's interesting to look through when you look at the cultural issues, the ones that don't code MAGA loyalist mainline Protestants white mainline Protestants are very similar to their evangelical ones. And then in the restrictive bathroom laws question, 38% of white non-mainline or white mainline non-evangelical Protestants oppose implementing restrictive bathroom laws. That is higher than white evangelical Protestants, which is 17%. Lower than Jewish Americans, which is 61. Unaffiliated religious people, 55. So, like it definitely, like when you're going through it, makes you as individuals who spend a lot of time with all their clergy, and the people educate them, going, well, there's a bottleneck here in how we understand the gospel.
Right. I don't know anybody in a theological who teaches in a theological seminary who agrees with anything that Donald Trump is doing.
Yeah, only 37% of white non-evangelical Protestants have favorable views of Black Lives Matter. 37% are favorable.
And you would never know that when you walked into basically any mainline divinity school in this country.
No, because they got a sign in the front.
Right. Right. And so like I said, I think it's really important to understand that individual congregations have done some incredibly brave work and continue to do that. And individual leaders within the mainline are also incredibly brave. And I do know a lot of mainline activists who are not ordained, who are putting their bodies on the line and doing all kinds of good work. But institutionally, these are pictures of us as a whole, and the picture of us as a whole is not where it needs to be. And of all of these different religious groups, that white non-evangelical group that is roughly the mainline is the only one that even has some of these 60-40 splits. So that means that we actually are having these arguments within our system structures and institutions. Now, that might be why there's still a lot of division.
Yeah.
So that no clear side is sort of won. But it also does mean that the temptation is to ignore the argument and keep your head down until the storm passes, instead of actually trying to mount a rigorous sort of theological debate within these traditions in order to actually convince people about the nature of ethics and the moral life of Jesus going into the 21st century. And so if we were following the example of Reinhold Niebuhr, as I was told to do when I was a little girl, we would be doing the latter and not the chicken out former. And what is happening, the decline of the mainline. Oh, we can't upset the boat. More people might go away. No. That's a bad excuse for ignoring a moral argument, for ignoring a moral crisis in a nation. Because you're afraid your roof's going to leak. And so you're not going to talk about the most important issues facing global life today because, oh, we don't like to talk about politics because it upsets our biggest donor. Well, why do you think your church is declining?
Mm-hmm.
If you're moral cowards, the people who understand that the greatest issues facing the human race that are possible to face, we're facing right now. And if you're ignoring it because you don't want to upset your biggest donor, that's why your church is declining. I mean, how many times do I have to say that? I'm sorry.
Uh,
I'm sorry.
no, I just hit retweet.
I mean, that's the crisis right there.
Did you? There's this sense, and this was Tripp's response, and then I thought Diana's going to tell me I'm wrong, and I don't want to be publicly embarrassed if I made a slide for it. But I wanted to make a slide that just said mainline Protestants are boomer Democrats, and they really do want the years Republicans think they want. So like they love the idea of religious pluralism. 74% of non-evangelical white Protestants prefer the U.S. to be made up of people belonging to a variety of religions. Contrast to 47, right, for white evangelicals.
Right. These are real points of difference
Yeah,
between those
but
two.
then the great replacement theory question just creeped me out. 4 in 10, 41% of white mainline non-evangelical Protestants agree that immigrants are invading the country and replacing the cultural ethnic background. So what that tells me is they really liked when mainline Protestantism was culture dominant, and our presidents and Supreme Court justices were a variety of Protestants, maybe a liberal Catholic, and we're uncomfortable with cultural change and are associating that cultural change with immigration of other ethnic groups and religious groups and cultural groups. That there's if it's 41% for mainliners, it's only 57% for evangelicals. So it's not like they're like this significant gap there. But even the questions around like inclusion, 37% of mainliners agree that traditional gender roles improve society. And then, and you would but if you hung out with leadership, that is not what the assumption would be. And even in the nationalism question, with a quarter of mainline Protestants having, favorable associations with Christian nationalism, it to me there seems a sense that desire for what happened when the myth of the Christian century is what they really want,
Right.
And so
Yes.
that is a stumbling block in a sense of taking that same. If you take someone like Niebuhr or Rauschenbusch, these figures of a deep ethical public Christianity, having those same passion in our current much more diverse nation, it seems that there's a lot of mainline Protestants that are more attached to the ethnic, social, cultural privilege and makeup of the past than the animating passion of the faith.
Well, this is the much less emotionally explosive Diana. This is the more analytical one about to show up. And that is, I think overall, American Protestantism has been in a significant crisis for about the last 30 or 40 years about what it is and what the direction will be for the future. And what's happened on both sides of the ledger of Protestantism, the evangelical and charismatic Pentecostal side of the ledger, and the mainline and liberal progressive part of the ledger, is that both groups are actually caught up in forms of theological and historical nostalgia. It just depends on where they're placing the nostalgia. And so evangelicals and Pentecostals, by and large, want to go back to the 1950s with clear gender roles, or the 1920s when, sort of the Pentecostal movement was first starting, or or parts of the 19th century when evangelicals essentially ruled sort of American religion, the American religion roost. So, it kind of depends. And then there are some evangelicals who want to go back to the Reformation and that we know those people. You and I actually know a lot of those people. But then liberals are also nostalgic. And you hear this all the time in mainline churches. Oh, if only it was like, such and such a year when the Sunday schools were full. Or the people will come back once they get married and have children. Or, we've gotten along here for all these years and we just don't understand why anybody doesn't want to come to our church anymore. And you start interrogating that, and usually they posit a golden age, sometime in. Occasionally you'll hear the 1950s. I don't hear the 1950s very often anymore in any of these churches. I much more hear the 1970s or the 1990s, which are sort of, I think, become sort of the two memory golden ages for the mainline. I remember both of them actually pretty clearly in the mainline. There were good reasons to value both of those periods historically. There were some very interesting and very brave things that happened. I think about the 1970s and the shift towards women's ordination and all of the arguments that were emerging around that, and very brave choices that were made about race, very brave choices about gender and theological education. Lots of really interesting things happened in the 70s, and the churches they were smaller than they had been in the 50s and 60s, but they weren't all that small. They were still relatively large, and they were still culture makers. And then you get to the 1990s, and I remember that very clearly. And that was a really robust and interesting time in the mainline. There were a lot of very exciting things that happened. And a lot of the churches that have been in decline actually grew in the 90s. And so I feel like the liberal churches, the white non-evangelical Protestants that we're talking about, are largely stuck in one of those two nostalgias. And so if you think about what were the primary issues in the 1970s or the primary issues in the 1990s, they reflect what you're seeing in those surveys. And yet we're almost 30 years on from the 1990s. And that means that's when Diana's blood starts boiling, is because we sort of stopped in that time period. Not everybody, and not all the theological seminaries and stuff. Lots of them are moving on and figuring out interesting new theological questions to ask. But the churches themselves haven't found a sort of a new footing of meaning past probably the early aughts. And so that means they kind of got frozen in time. So they can't deal with, say, transgender issues or the issue of bathrooms or understanding how younger generations of people are conceptualizing identity and sexuality. These things they don't even want to think about it. It hurts their brains. And so, and then immigration. There's a difference in immigration from the 70s to the 90s to now. And then also, I think there are some real issues around the growth of non-religious identity that have been, by and large, ignored in these churches. And so I think that that's reflective in these statistics and how they kind of get tripped up in different and kind of unexpected areas. So this is Diana's more analytical piece, and what I would love to see, and certainly I think what I've been working for in my entire career, and I think that Tripp, you actually are working for this, coming from a place of a different generation. But I think both you and I we love the past and we love talking about the history and we love understanding it, but we're also asking the question, what about the future? And trying to envision what does a robust life of following Jesus look like in this cultural setting and the cultural settings that are likely to emerge for our children and grandchildren.
Yeah. It makes me think you should write a book called Christianity After Religion, because there's all of the changing
Oh my
factors that
gosh.
if we have church institutional religion trapped in nostalgia, it uh might need to move beyond the nostalgia.
I was going to close my comments today by saying I wrote at the cottage a piece last night that I sent out rather late, and so people may or may not have seen it. I urge my readers and anybody who might be interested in it to look at it. And it was called "Sacred Rebellion?" question mark. And I actually went back, Tripp, and looked at Christianity after religion, and said that I'd gotten something wrong. That I
Oh,
really something that, well, I'm not sure I exactly got it wrong, but I think that my optimism might have obscured something I was unwilling to see. And so I talk about that in this newsletter. And what was very interesting, this is this doesn't show up in the writing. This happened after I wrote it. I read most of my pieces out loud to Richard. He's so wonderful, my husband. He puts up with me reading to him all the time. And so I was reading what I had written, and I got up to this part where I started talking about Christianity of religion after religion. And there's a line in the that I wrote. It says, "Maybe this is why I've been so sad." And when I read that line, I broke out in tears. And so, yeah, Christianity after religion.
well, that is a most effective clickbait to go read your newest Substack when I finally open up email and don't get depressed. Just the idea of opening email. Now there's a newsletter I'm excited to check out.
Well,
'Cause
it was real important to me.
yeah, and I would ask a follow up, but that would lead to a whole nother hour of conversation.
Yeah, we're
But I
closing
told
here.
you when I read Christian Smith's new book, how how much it reminded me of that book, and and so I do think there's, and I know a couple other books that are similar that are in the works and such. So I think there's a larger critical mass of people recognizing that predicament. So hopefully that will generate enough courage for uh, something new rather than
Yeah.
uh, a little outpost of nostalgia in a changing world.
I certainly hope that's the case, and I don't want to sound, like, I told you so. That's not never my intention, although sometimes it is a temptation. Um, the uh, I am often reminded that it is possible to sometimes show up too early to a party, and in effect, I feel like sometimes that's what my own work has done, is that I, for whatever reason, I saw something 18 years ago that say that the Christian Smith book saw in the last 3 years while he was working on that project, and that's a very confirming thing for me, but it's also kind of hard. And what it the other side of that is, it means I've been living with these ideas for a lot longer than many people have been. And so I can see them from a variety of prismatic angles, perhaps emotionally and historically, in terms of recent developments that maybe some other commentators might miss. Um, and my own, sort of, like when I was exploding about how I'm literally heartbroken that I feel like the white mainline churches failed in significant ways in the last 20 years. And it was hard to watch that happen, especially when it's now led us to this place. And it doesn't mean I think you're all failures, or that I don't love you, and that I don't love these organizations. I still go to church. I love my pastor. I give money to my church. I support the work of bishops in the Episcopal Church. I have done my best to continue to love, even while I was watching a painful descent into the place that has given us the last 100 days.
Yeah. Well, there we go. We did it.
We
We
did it.
ruined whatever. And
Well, my friendship with you is not ruined.
that's
And
good.
I'm glad that we've always been on this journey together.
Well, I am glad I didn't discover one slide in. It was a really bad idea to try to structure it that way. I was sitting there.
Oh, it's
I
interesting.
was sitting there going like, if this goes south, you're going to have spent all this time. Uh, but
Tripp, I appreciate what I mean. One of the reasons I love working with you is that you bring an angle to the same things I see, but you see them from another perspective. And so when we get together and we have this conversation, I feel like we often just manage to push we push each other further.
well, thank you everyone that's here who for being a part of one or the elect both of our substacks. And
We should give some sort of special prize to people who are paid subscribers of both of them.
oh yeah, yeah, we have to come up with one.
Yeah, we
And
do. We should come up with
one.
something.
I'm going through storage currently of all the random stuff I've made for different homebrewed things. So I may have a whole assortment of different stuff I've made. I found posters that I made of Jürgen Moltmann when I did the podcast for the anniversary edition of Crucified God, where he's on a beer label. I found theologian trading cards I made 1 year. If people have always said to themselves, I need some theologian trading cards, because who doesn't want to have a Schleiermacher in their pocket?
I do have the artwork of me on a beer can.
Yes. Yeah. There's a host of different
sword trophy, Laura Z says.
Oh, you know the sword drill trophy from Theology Beer Camp, because not it all. If you win a sword drill at Theology Beer Camp, then you need a trophy. And I found that Christian homeschooler place that made trophies where the shaft of the trophy is an American flag. And then on top you got like a cross, a Bible, and an eagle, because Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And it said on it,
that.
I slaughtered all the foes of the Lord with my sword at Theology Beer Camp.
It's so bad. Hey, well, do you think we're gonna make it, Tripp?
Oh, I'm optimistic. I mean, I feel like we if Donald Trump is wanting to make sure everyone knows how bad of an idea he was, and
that's true.
Hopefully, it creates a generation who is more attached to our collective process and values, deliberation across difference for mutual flourishing. That's something that I think since 9/11 on, there's just been so many cycles that generate more and more cynicism. And if this experience has a new it creates a new critical mass that values the larger democratic experiment, and churches that value having a confident voice in it, then hopefully in the long term it could be positive.
But yeah, I want to know where those really activist sort of churches are out in Silicon Valley, and how they're witnessing to the tech bro guys and that whole culture out there. I know a little of that. There's kind of an evangelical movement going on out there.
Yeah,
but that worries me as much as anything else. But the idea of some really extraordinary, sane, interesting, progressive, perhaps process type communities that are trying to get a different vision of humanity and God into the ether and the ecosystem out there. I would love to hear about that.
Well, I'm just earlier today, I was talking with Aaron Stauffer, who's the director of the Wendland Cook Center for Justice and Religion at Vanderbilt. And and I reached out. We were talking about I've had a number of people that from Homebrewed stuff joined their solidarity circles, which is like a cohort model for learning um, organizing and movement practices, but it's geared for faith leaders to help congregations or nonprofits and stuff engage both faith and justice and local activism and community organizing. And so many people that have joined it over the last 2-3 years since I've talked about it on the podcast have gone through it and are doing stuff. He was telling me about it. So I think in a next month or so, we're going to do an episode that is based on 5 or 6 people who went through it and are doing local organizing stuff in different parts of the country, and use their stories as a way of telling, like, what is a theology of organizing and movement politics for people of faith. And hopefully that, because they have such a really cool program where you do it online and it's like this kind of like a mentor and cohort model, but where throughout it you're working with the faith community you know lead in.
Mm-hmm.
And just when I was hearing the stories, I got more optimistic, and then to think, oh, what could they tell the stories, and then in it him kind of introduce some of the kind of like the theory and organizing principles for people that might be in a position to have a community and do something, because
That's a really good idea.
doing something that's hopeful
Mm-hmm.
is a great way of generating hope. And then hearing about things no one knows about that other people that just happen to listen to the podcast are doing, you go, oh, well, they can do it then.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was having that same intuition, heard some stories from people, reached out there, and I was like, can we do something just to tell their stories and help people see how it works? And he was like, oh, that'd be great. So
That's great. I love, obviously, that's where Christianity for the Rest of Us started, was a book about telling stories about churches in the 90s who were doing really the powerful transformative work that needed to be done then.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, my friend, we do have to close. Boy, 2 hours. It goes 5.
Well,
we try to keep it to 90, but
it was making up for missing it for a bit.
Yeah.
Next time we'll make sure we don't go long. Well, I say that. We'll have intentions.
That's right.
All righty. Bye, everybody.
Bye, friends.